anti-government demonstrations took place for a 27th week in a row. 140 protesters rallied in Tel Aviv, but organizers are saying that the number was much higher and closer to 180,000 as more anger mounts over the coalition's renewed effort to curb the country's judiciary. Protest leaders have pledged to further intensify demonstration efforts and disrupt the country's day-to-day activities. It comes as the government now plans to pass the first reading of a bill to remove the High Court's ability to rule on the, quote, reasonableness of government decisions. The move would prevent the judiciary from using this argument to review decisions made by the cabinet, the government, ministers, and other elected officials. Let's take a listen now to some of those demonstrators.
The government is continuing to drag us into chaotic state. Unfortunately, we don't know, no one knows what will happen this week in Israel, but clearly things will not be as usual. All kinds of activities from protesters from different movements, from the military reserve, were not going to duty because now their duty is to protect the democracy from the pilots, from the physicians, from the healthcare professionals, from the high-tech industry, because if there is no democracy, there is no high-tech.
We came to protest for the last 27 weeks. We are here every week, same spot, and we came to protest against the intention of this government to cancel the rule of reason and actually will bring us to a non-democracy in Israel.
Well, today, the Israeli government will examine measures to support the Palestinian Authority and prevent its possible collapse. The cabinet will look into options like staggering debt payments, extending opening hours for the Allenby crossing, and issuing biometric passports. They'll also discuss other economic opportunities like the establishment of an industrial zone in the West Bank and a marine gas field off the shores of Gaza. These discussions come in the wake of defense recommendations to strengthen the governing body to avoid deterioration in the West Bank. Let's bring in I-24 News senior political correspondent Owen Alterman live with us in studio. Owen, let's first talk about the anti-government protests. 27th week of demonstrations, organizers vowing for heavy days of disruption ahead, specifically on Tuesday. But the initial reading of the bill is on Monday. What can we expect this week?
Look, a lot is up in the air, Hamda. The demonstrators have to make the case to the public and through the public to the wider world that this is an emergency, right? Because again, protesters are using extreme tactics, right? We saw it last week, the protests at the airport, protests by the homes of members of parliament and ministers. We're going to see again another angry day of protests on Tuesday, as they're saying, and they need to make the case that all of this is justified because this is a genuine emergency. You go back to February and March, that case was made, the public was broadly supportive, and of course, in a fairly fantastic way, Benjamin Netanyahu made a complete retreat on March 27th that put so much of this judicial overhaul on ice. This time it's a bit of a closer call. We're starting to get indications. Again, a poll from Israel's Channel 12 News put out on Friday. On one hand, a majority of the public supports the protesters. And Hamda, that's no mean feat. This is the same public that just a few months ago elected this government.
Exactly.
Again, by a narrow majority, but by a majority nonetheless. And now we have 57% of the public supporting the demonstrators. And some unbelievable statistics, including 10% of Likud voters themselves have attended at least one protest over the course of months against the overhaul. So that gives you an indication. On the other hand, significant majorities among the public opposing, for example, protests at the airport to potentially hurt its functioning and maybe even shut it down. Majorities against the blocking of roads, and very, very strong majorities up until even a consensus among the government's own base against these things. So I think both sides can find reason to have optimism from the numbers in that poll, and I think it points to a situation where things are very much up in the air. On the one hand, the protest movement has shown it can really mobilize its people, including its core activists, and show a lot of energy, even renewed energy, right? Not that the energy had ever really disappeared over the course of 27 weeks rather, but you see it resurfacing in a bigger way. Also, the high-tech companies starting to get involved, allowing workers to take days off in many cases on Tuesday to protest. And Benny Gantz, finally, the de facto opposition leader, head of the National Unity Party, the most moderate party leader from within the opposition, coming out strongly behind the protests and in terms of intensifying the protests. Indications, I think, Hamda, that the protest movement believes it can win this argument and convince the public that this is an emergency. On the other hand, at least for the time being, the coalition seems to believe that time is on its side, that they'll be able to show the public that protesters have overreached and that they'll win the argument. I think it's genuinely up in the air, and I think the next few days will give us an indication. And based on that information, I think Netanyahu will make his final decision. But whether to take this bill to the finish line, because of course the vote on Monday is a first reading, it's not the second and third readings, Netanyahu will have to make a decision about how far to go.
Before we get into the Palestinian Authority, I want to ask you quickly, the talks for any sort of compromise have actually totally collapsed, and the coalition just went ahead to push through these bills. What are the protesters arguing is the danger here of passing this bill specifically on the reasonableness clause? If you could break that down for us.
Right, two quick points. First of all, you're absolutely right, Hamda. The actual talks have broken down, but what's actually happening here is a kind of de facto negotiation, right? Netanyahu having given up or at least put on ice large parts of this package and seeing what he can do and how far he can go without triggering mass protests. So there's kind of de facto negotiation, if you will, with the protesters and by extension, the foreign exchange markets and the Biden administration. As for the reasonableness standard, this allows courts to overturn decisions by the government and by individual ministers that are, quote, unreasonable. Those who support the standard see it as an essential tool by the courts to stop corruption in political appointments and to stop overreach by ministers and to put some kind of bounds on what they do. Opponents of this standard say it puts too much power in the hands of judges instead of elected officials, and it's too squirmy and squishy a standard, and therefore it's very, very hard to put into a box and gives, again, too much power to the judges.